So what I want to do is, I'll just give you like a real short overview of my story, my life, just so you can understand what I'm saying. But what I'm going to do is talk about the last 45 years and divide it into two parts. The 70s and 80s, and talk about my experience with India and what I saw and what I did in India, which was in the nonprofit world, and what I learned out of that. And then the next 20 plus years, 25 years, if you take it to the present. And again, the change that India went through and how the business I set up, which had a very big India component, benefited and participated in that change. And again, what I learned out of that. Those learnings are not, they don't necessarily fall under the banner of ethical leadership totally, but they are very much part of what guided me in terms of how I go about leading my life and working with organizations and so on and so forth. So, and as I said, anytime just feel free to interrupt, and if we run out, I can move what I'm saying quite flexibly, so it's more important we talk about what you want really than what I want. But just let me give you a quick overview of my life. So I was born in Australia, which you probably read about, in 1950, which for all of you is a couple of 3 centuries ago. I grew up on a farm, and I was actually the first person in my family to go past grade 7 in school. So I grew up on a farm that my ancestors had settled in 1839, and that's what they'd done. I also went to law school, and in the end of the first year I had the opportunity to come to the US, and I lived on the west side of Chicago in 1969, and that's where I met Neil, where we both were working in an organization where I was really learning what I would now call a sort of a comprehensive approach to community development, which focused on giving people the skills and the support to do their own development. Following that, I spent 6 years living in India, where I worked in village development and living in villages, and that's really where I kind of, I suppose, the gift I got was that I really grasped that the essence of life is about really living in the here and now in every moment, So often we're tempted to either live in the past and get caught up in the if-onlys. If only I had another mother, or if only this, or if only that, or another wife, or whatever. Or the future. So often we spend our life living, it's when this happens, or when I get there, then I can live life full. And it's very interesting. When you're living in the raw reality of, getting up at 5 in the morning so that you can do your daily ablutions, go to the bathroom, and quote, in the dark in a field, and living your life in the joys of the village, that you really do learn that it's all in the here and now that's really important. And I spent 20 years in that nonprofit world, as I said, 6 in India. In 1989, I got to a point where I was ready for change. I had no money, which it was pretty much because this nonprofit organization really fundamentally meant no pay. My pay was not in money, but in other things, I guess. And I was ready for a change. I had a couple of kids, and I did what any sensible person would do. I started a business. For I discovered that there was, what I thought anyway, was a real opportunity to take what I had learned by leading and working in a nonprofit sector and translate it into the business world, or I wanted to see if you could put it that way. And so I decided, in short, to kind of hire myself and started a IT professional firm that eventually grew to 7,500 people working in 8 countries. And this was a really great 20 years of growth, and it wasn't something I did, it was a real team effort of literally thousands of people. And what I appreciate most about Canbay, which was the name of the company, was that it wasn't perceived as, you know, my company or the three of us who started this company. It was literally perceived by all of those people as their company. We eventually went public on the NASDAQ in 2004 and were acquired by a French consulting company called Capgemini in 2006, formalized in February 2007. And then I ran for a couple of years their global financial services business. And this was quite interesting because Capgemini was 120,000 people, 13 billion, and I was one of 7 people who were part of their global leadership team, and that was quite a different experience than doing your own thing. In 2009, or at the end of 2009, I'm sorry, at the beginning of 2009, I returned to Australia. I hadn't lived there since I was 18 years old, so that in itself was quite a shock. And today I chair a couple of non-profit, well, one non-profit board there, there's a Health and Medical Research Institute that I chair, and I chair the state's Economic Development Board, which advises the government on economic policy and direction. And I've got some investments in a number of small businesses, the most fun one of which is a winery, but an energy company, a mining company, and a number of technology startups. But I don't operate them, I work with them as a director or a chairman of their board or something like that. Trying to take what I learned in 45 years and not tell them what to do, but to help ask them the right questions so they can figure out what to do. So let's talk about my 45-year journey with India. You know, in late 1969, just after Christmas, I first landed in India as a 19-year-old, having spent the year prior, or the 10 months prior, in the heart of Chicago with Neil and others. And I guess the way to talk about India in those days, in the sort of the 70s and 80s, is it was truly the land of extremes. You know, it was the land of extremes, of shortages, and I would say just impossibility. And this is epitomized by when you fly into Bombay, as it was called then. You literally fly over within 6 feet, because it's right to the end of the runway, of what at that time was the world's largest slum. So here you are coming in, whatever you're coming in. I can't remember what the plane was in 1969, probably a 707.
707.
But, you know, whatever was modern, and you're flying over a slum. And the minute you open the door of the airplane in India is a sensory attack. You know, it's the smells, it's the noise, it's the people. I didn't realize how, I lived in India for 6, but for 3 without leaving. And then I came to Chicago in the middle of 1973. And I will never forget this experience. I arrived in an afternoon, went to this place where I'd lived before, and the next day went downtown because I wanted to buy a couple of things. And I had this absolutely eerie feeling. I couldn't get my head around it, and then I realized there were no people. Hell were all the people.
In downtown Chicago.
In downtown Chicago. By comparison to what you just get inundated with in India. And I'm convinced a lot of foreigners in those days when they went to India got sick, and I became totally convinced that it had nothing to do with anything they ate, but it was truly the sensory and psychological overload. You know, it's so, every sense you have gets stimulated. And so I used to warn new arrivals when they came, if you want to survive this, don't compare it to anything else. Just start appreciating, you know, accepting someplace different. But in those days, India was tough. We had food rationing. You had to have a ration card to get to buy your food. We had water where I lived for between 15 and 30 minutes a day. So you really monitored that and made sure you caught enough. You know, I used to ask visitors to bring me razor blades and batteries because, and you could get them in India, but they were absolutely crap. You know, there were no ready-made clothes. Everybody had their clothes tailored. I mean, it was a very closed economy. The currency was controlled, which actually led to a phenomenally thriving and large black market, and that affected a lot of the way you operated. There were travel restrictions for Indians, not legally, but financially. You know, people couldn't travel even if you had the rupees because you couldn't get the money. And the extremes of the society were cemented in kind of the class structure, which in 1970 was pretty much the same as it was in 1770. In that there were three very distinct classes of people. There were what I would call the elite class. In the 1770s, that was the Maharajas and the high priests in the temples. And in the 1970s, it was the industrialists, which were household names in India at that time. The trading families, the Marwari trading families, who again were household names. They tended to name their companies after their name. And political families, particularly the Nehru clan. So Indira Gandhi, who was Nehru's daughter, was the prime minister. And the palaces were now five-star hotels. But it was, you know, there was this very elite, and I mean elite, very wealthy by any standard, group of people who were at the, you know, the very tip of the Indian iceberg. Then, at the other end, was the bulk of the iceberg, which was the subsistence class. People who truly struggled day to day for their existence, largely rural. In those days, there were certainly urban slums, nothing like there are today, because the mass migration to the city hadn't happened at the rate it now happens today. But people who lived in raw poverty economically, but very rich social and cultural lives. And that's the thing you discovered in working in the villages. And then you had in the middle this small middle class, who were basically made up of civil servants, the government employees. There were sort of traders, you know, the people who traded food and so on. And by that stage, managers of businesses. But the middle class, by proportion, was very small and actually quite powerless in terms of really affecting any change. They tended to just be part of the you know, consistency of thing. And this class structure worked its way down at all levels. So at the village, at every village, you had also a version of the elite. Now, nothing that compared to industrial, but you had the money lender, for example, who controlled often many villages and controlled the destiny and lives of many people in the villages. To the people in the middle class, I guess, in a village were more equivalent, say, to the teacher who may have been sent to that village if the village had a school, or maybe another senior government worker. And then you had the subsistence, who were the small farmers whose farms barely eked out a living for their family, and then the landless laborers, who were the most deprived, obviously. And the Harijans, the people who in the caste system were part of the outcast. So it was a very stultified society, and change just seemed impossible in the early 70s. And yet, by this time, there were some green shoots emerging. One of them was very much the agricultural revolution that was just starting. And it sort of started in the mid-60s, but it was in the Punjab. But the so-called Green Revolution was just starting to take root across the country. And it was very interesting. In visiting villages, most villages' homes had pictures of three people. Who do you think they were? How good are you in India? One you're bound to know. Who would be the most prominent person in India in the 70s, you know, from sort of immediate history?
Gandhi.
Gandhi, yeah. Who was the second picture? You may not know, although I mentioned his name earlier. It was Nehru, the first prime minister after independence. And then there was a third picture.
God. Or a God.
Oh, but yes, there were always gods. There's a different set of pictures in them, because every home had a temple, so you're quite right, the gods. But the third picture inevitably was Kennedy. And that was because the U.S., through USAID, had sponsored and funded the Green Revolution. And that was having such an impact in India that at the village level, the prominence of America as a really positive force in social change was epitomized by Kennedy's picture. I mean, this is well after he was dead, but that got associated, the Peace Corps and the work that was done through the Peace Corps and Green Revolution made a huge difference. So there were changes happening in villages. Many of them by this stage did have a school, which they wouldn't have had in the past. Many, although the ones I lived in, didn't have electricity at this time. But it was also, you know, it wasn't, the change wasn't solidified. And this is the environment in which, you know, we worked. We worked for an organization, when I say we, Neil and I, called the Institute of Cultural Affairs. And the reason I got attracted to it was it kind of, when I was in law school, I was involved in working with Aboriginal rights in Australia. And I really liked the kind of what I would call the business approach this organization took to development. Now, let me put that in perspective for you, particularly if you're thinking about the non-profit world. In those days, in the 60s, there were kind of two extremes to the way you did development. One was relief. You just gave people stuff. And if you gave them enough stuff, you know, maybe they'd get out of this endless cycle of poverty. Now, there are times when you do have to give people stuff, right? Like, you know, traumatic floods and so on, or when people lose their homes. Relief is up. There is a role for relief. But the reality was, by the time I got involved in development, it was clear that simply giving people stuff didn't really change anything. And on the other hand, there was a philosophy that was basically the smart ones will pull themselves up by the bootstraps, and the others, you know, if they're not bright enough to do that, well, tough. Now, the interesting thing is that the ICA's approach, in a way, recognized there was wisdom in both those approaches, but that neither one alone, you know, would be successful. And that the ICA's philosophy was that the key to sustainable development, you know, development that could take root and people could change, was that people need to own or take responsibility for their development. But they also need appropriate support and access to partners who can help them with that development, partners who have key knowledge or know-how or government relations or whatever. They need skills, no different than today, right? They need education, maybe not in the formal sense of education that you have. They need health care, you know, they need to be healthy. And they do need access to capital. Now, not again in huge amounts. And I don't know if you're familiar, but there's been a whole movement around small-scale lending, and a very famous Bangladesh guy started a thing called the group.
Micro-lending.
Yeah, micro-lending, but what's the name of his bank? There's something bank, anyway. And where the maximum loan was $100. But what these $100 loans would do was absolutely phenomenal. So the ICA's work was around balancing, and what we did in India was we balanced training with action. So on the training side, we had lots of courses, and we worked with people who were involved in village development. A lot of those were, say, Catholic religious orders, like one of the people that we worked with was Mother Teresa's order, the Little Sisters of Charity. And, you know, one of the great memories in my life certainly was meeting her for the first time. I met her a few times, but I particularly remember the first time. We worked with, there was a whole lot of village development being done by people who were disciples of Gandhi, and they had an approach that was kind of stuck in the 30s and 40s, and they at that time were quite open to the approach we took. We worked with social agencies, and we were teaching them both. We had a whole lot of training programs that focused both on kind of, you know, short courses for sort of lay people, if you will, or ordinary people, around helping people understand what was happening in the world and what within their community or society, what you could do to change it, and kind of the individual skills you needed to do that. There was literally the practical skills of, you know, how you go about village development, how you go about facilitating change, planning. And then there was, and you'll have gotten the importance of this from the book you're reading, we had direct courses on what you might call personal care and personal growth. How do you develop the ability to reflect and to know yourself and to build on your strengths and so on. And then, in addition to the training, we had what we called demonstration projects. So we did work in villages, and we lived in villages. And the approach of the Institute, or the ICA, was to take a comprehensive approach, which meant rather than just solving one or two or three of the major problems, you had to, in fact, address all the problems, the economic problems, so agriculture and employment and so on, social problems like education, health, etc., and organizational, the political problems. And so we started our work in a state called Maharashtra, which was the state of which Bombay was the capital, and we did our work. Our first demonstration project, which became a teaching village, was a little village called Malewada, which is symbolically really well located. It was next to a very famous fort that had a 1,000-year history, and next to a set of caves, which I think are the singular best thing to go visit in India, far more important than the Taj Mahal, which had, they were first started in 500 BC, and 36 caves that evolved over a 1,000-year period from 500 BC to about 500 AD. And we chose this village, A, because of its location, but also because it really was emblematic, if you like, of villages in that state. It didn't have electricity, it didn't have a whole lot of things, and yet it had potential. It wasn't hopeless. And eventually, to cut a long story short, we ended up having 4 teaching villages across the state, 1 in each county, and then 232 villages, 1 in each council, say, would be a roughly equivalent of this state. And that, and part of, I think, and so it was by training, literally, we had something like 10,000 village people trained in these methods over the course of 10 years, of which I was there for 6. So that was a very interesting phase in my life, obviously. I guess what I didn't say was I did live in villages, but I also spent quite a bit of time meeting the leaders of industry who we got to support our work, and really household names, like one of them was J.R.D. Tata, who was the head of the Tata Group, and so on. And getting those people involved in this effort was really interesting. So I later did planning processes with them using the same methods and approaches we use working in villages, helping them do their plans. And it was interesting, when I was in the city, we were so poor we didn't have an office. So I used to work out of the lobby of the best hotel, because I figured if you're gonna work somewhere, you might as well have an air-conditioned office. And I could only ever afford 1 cup of coffee or tea, so I'd get that cup of coffee, sit in the lobby and milk it for about 5 hours. But in the process, I got to know the manager and people, and they got involved in the work, and I guess I learned in that process. So I would go to a lot of really good parties, and Indians have really good parties. They don't start till 9 o'clock at night. You don't eat till about midnight or 1. Drink whiskey, and so I used to eat beforehand. But I got to know a lot of really important, wealthy people from that elite group, and I found sort of I could be as happy there as I was in the village, or conversely, I suppose you would say I could be as happy in the village as I was there. So what did I learn during that phase? Well, I guess as I think back on it, that was my university education, because I never went back to law school. I don't have a degree other than the one conferred on me last May, which was an honorary degree. But during those 6, 7, and then the 20 years, but really the 6 or 7 where I lived in India, and then after that I used to go back to India 4 or 5 times a year, I kind of learned some basic life skills that really helped me form who I was and provided a basis for doing what I did. So let me share 4 of those. The first is that I learned to be a lifelong inquirer. I discovered that life is a mix of things that you can understand and things that are an absolute complete mystery, and both deserve rational and intuitive inquiry. The ability to be aware, to pay attention to your environment, and be knowledgeable about what's happening around you is really an important skill to success. And living in the villages, I really learned that the best way to learn things was being willing to ask questions and then listen. And I'm always amazed at how much most people really enjoy sharing their thinking. people really like to be asked a question. Now some people think that in order to be smart, you have to show how smart you are. I actually think that being smart, the smartest people know how to ask the right question. And I kind of learned that in India. And the wisdom I got from villages in India was phenomenal. And I still apply that. You know, the other day I was in Adelaide and I was sitting with 3 women discussing, businesswomen, what can be done to address the lack of women in leadership roles in business. And I used kind of a method of inquiry that our organization had developed that sort of starts by asking the most basic, factual, objective kind of questions to get sort of a clear picture of reality, because if you're not facing reality, if you're not talking about the real life, you're not on a very good position to think. And then move to a level of reflection by getting out people's feelings and emotions. A lot of people skip over that, but it's so important to speak and understand your emotions. And men really find that very difficult. And then I moved to the interpretive level where, you know, we discuss what it all means or what can be done about it, and then finally to the decisional level of, you know, so commitment, what are we actually going to do? Now this simple little method elicited, in this case, not only a very spirited conversation with the 4 of us that went on a couple of hours longer than we'd planned and came up with a couple of phenomenal programs that we're going to implement, but it recalled for me how I was sitting around on the cow dung floors of people's homes, and you'd have half a dozen village people and cups of tea, and we would ask similar questions, and out of it get great insights into what needed to happen in that village. And then it was all about going and doing those insights, and that's how people owned their development. A lot of it they came up with themselves. We live in a time of lifelong learning, and you know, people talk about the learning organization and all that kind of stuff. But it's even more overwhelming today, given there's so much information out there. And yet, with all this data, actually I think in many ways we know less, because we're so inundated by data that we don't have the ability to process it and to sift through where the critical information is that, you know, leads to the insights that can lead to action. And that's something I really worry about. I've got 2 teenage boys, and I really worry about that in terms of the generation we're living in now. And I experience it myself. I can get caught up in a day just being flooded by information and never processing it. And I think inquiry is not just about being like someone with their mouth open in a fire hydrant, but it's about processing that data. And that's tough. But I think to be smart requires lifelong inquiry. The second thing I learned living in India was that there is a solution to every problem. There's nothing that can happen in life that cannot be worked through. Reasons why things can't happen. And the phrase you heard in the 70s more often than not was, it's impossible. It's impossible. And yet I learned from watching really smart village people to view problems as challenges, and each challenge bringing with an opportunity to reflect and grow and to push your limits. You've got to acknowledge those limits, for sure. So a simple way of saying that is, for me, I say that for success, IQ is not nearly as important as I will. So to be a leader, I think, is to understand that there is a solution to every problem. Third is to treasure integrity. I really learned that the importance of wrestling with your values and taking the time to decide what's really important in your life. You know, looking at things from many sides, you know, and understanding that you know, you do have choices about what you say is important or what you value, but making that choice and then being true to it. And I think the real strength of an Indian village is the strength and value of their values, but it can also be a real problem in that those values can get stultified and particularly behaviors get frozen. And we experience that in the way young girls and women were treated in villages. And you know, Indian villages even who didn't have an education, value education, they would do anything to get their boys educated, but they wouldn't do anything to get their girls educated. And we insisted that if you were going to have send a child to school, you had to send all your children to school. It was all or none. I think treasuring your integrity is key to success. And then last, doing stuff, risking action. I learned that it's all about getting things done. You can think the big thoughts, but a commitment to action is absolutely critical. And, you know, action is pretty straightforward. It boils down to hard work. You know, and frankly, I don't know anybody who drowned in their own sweat. So that's what I got out of the first 20 years of my nonprofit world and wrestling with India and so on. To be a lifelong inquirer, that there's a solution to every problem, to treasure your integrity and to risk action. Fast forward or backwards, but from this story to essentially the 90s and the 2000s, India was and still is a land of extremes. A lot of what I described about India in the 70s is still there, but there's been a huge shift around in perspective, and there's a huge focus now on growth, on openness and possibility. And it was in the 80s, late 80s, 90s, and 2000 that we saw the enormous rise of the middle class. There is still an elite, and there's still a subsistence class, but the middle class is what really grew in this period. And today they estimate there's 350 million people in the Indian middle class. Now, if you take the American middle class and the Indian middle class and look at their sort of financial flows, the American middle class has more money if you take the real value of the dollar versus the rupee. But what we found in our business was the spendable cash. There was actually more in India. Our people in India who were paid competitive Indian salaries, who worked in technology, software programs and so on, had a lot more expendable cash than their counterparts in the US. For instance, most of them would have had 1 or 2 or 3 people working in their home, a driver and a maid and so on and so forth. I was the CEO of the company. I didn't have a driver, I didn't have a maid. Well, we did have a person come into our house 1 day a week to help clean, but nothing like my Indian colleagues. And the rise of the middle class wasn't just, you know, civil servants and the managers and traders who were there before, but there was a huge increase in the professional workforce, often serving global markets, such as IT professionals, for instance, who work for us, software and hardware professionals, engineers, call center people. I mean, literally millions of people work in these fields that didn't exist, you know, in the 60s and 70s. And this has created all kinds of social upheaval. For instance, many of the people who work for my company, whose parents were bankers and teachers, for example, or civil servants, made 5 times what their parents made. Think about that. You go out of work, you get out of school, you get a job, and you're making, after a couple of years, 5 times what your parents made. Think what that does to the home life and the dynamics of life. This was a period of phenomenal change. India became a net exporter of food during this time. It made enormous investments in infrastructure. There were, I think, 10 new airlines created. Cell phones became ubiquitous. Even the poorest of the poor have cell phones in India. And phone calls are ridiculously cheap. Texting costs essentially nothing. Highways got created, ports got created, electricity expanded, airports and so on and so forth, and the economy opened up. Where today, Indian companies are owners of global brands, like Jaguar and Land Rover are owned by Indian companies, for example. And India did some of the best work in terms of government support for business of any country that I've seen. So it was in this context that, you know, my journey was about creating a business. I wanted to see if I could apply, as I said, what I'd learned about leadership to the business world. And so I started a company called Cambay with 2 other people, and what we did was focused on providing technology services. And kind of our company, if you think about it, had 5 lives. The first, from '89 to the mid-'90s, we started out by bringing Indian programmers to the United States. That's what we did. And providing supplemental staffing to companies here, like IBM in Dallas and so on. And what differentiated us, what we had learned in the nonprofit world, was our focus on the human factor, on the way, frankly, we treated our people. Some of our competitors from India really ran their businesses a lot like they would trading spice. It was, you know, you buy this spice for this price and you up it by 40% and sell it for this price. And we certainly did that. But we put enormous energy into creating the support and so on to make our people successful. But we also, in our second year, did what, at that point, very few to no other companies had done. And that was, instead of bringing people from India to the US, we took the work from the US to India and actually started programming and doing actual work in India and then bringing the software back to our clients. We did our first offshore project in 1990, which was almost groundbreaking. The second phase of our company was in 95, and we didn't have any money when we started it, so we were quite slow in growing. We really created a global software delivery platform and built a campus in India. And we worked hard to create an organization that had, within India and the US, because they were the two places we were getting work done, had a unified culture. And I'll talk more about that on Thursday. But we also built a campus that reflected that culture. So we built a campus on the edge of Pune that was very innovative in its architecture, for instance. We had round buildings, and the design of the interiors of the space reflected things like openness and teamwork and innovation. So in India, the traditional architectural structure for an office was the higher you were, the bigger your office. And all the people had their offices along the walls. They had all the light. The people who were doing the real work were in the dark. And we flipped all that. Firstly, we didn't have any offices, but secondly, the most junior programmers worked on the outside of the space, and the leadership was spread all around, and they didn't have desks, and they didn't have offices, they had desks. But we were after, you know, making sure we captured the concepts of innovation, teamwork, collaboration, so on. And we also focused heavily on learning and development programs because that not only focused on the technology, which our people were very good at anyway, and you always have to keep learning that, but focused on learning about the business world and leadership and communication and the soft skills that are so essential to success. We also built a world-class cafeteria and provided lunch and dinner for everybody every day, and we created transport for them to go home. So that we created an environment that just attracted and retained the brightest and the best in their field. And how do I know that? Well, there was a lot of turnover in our industry. The average company in our competitors lost 20% of their employees every year. Our turnover was less than 10%. We used to measure it positively. We had a retention rate of 90 to 91%. Then the third phase of our business was really growing it. And in 1998, we raised $10 million, which was the first time we had any real money. And we used that to put in place what we call the framework for scalability, things like methodology and so on. And then we went about really focusing the business. We had a real crisis in 2000 when the dot-com crisis hit. We had 3 companies that were our clients go bankrupt, and they owed us $8 million, and that damn near killed us. We got through that, and that's a whole other story, but we decided that we needed to really focus on a limited kind of clients, so we focused on banks and investment banks and really knowing how they work in depth. And that's what then allowed us to not just see India as a place you could do work that was less costly, but in fact we did much higher value work in India, and that's what really was the key to our success. And then we went public in 2004 and got bought in 2006. So in this period of my life, building on, I guess, my own life experience in the villages, I talk about it as a theme. The thing that I learned was the importance of doing everything and living your life with excellence. You know, what is excellence? You know, the dictionary defines excellence to mean of superior virtue or high in repute. And Aristotle once said, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit." And it's interesting to note that the opposite of excellence is mediocrity. You know, and from my experience, approaching any task or living a life where all right is good enough, or where you do enough to get away with it, or where you settle for second best, frankly tends to lead to frustration and misery. You know, I would suggest that contentment comes from striving for excellence in everything you do, even if you fall short of your aspirations. Excellence is not the goal, it's the journey. And that's what frankly led to our success, was that we had 7,500 people who understood that their personal life and their work life was about excellence. That was the heart of our culture. So what is excellence from my perspective? Well, I think excellence starts, or how do you live a life of excellence? I think it starts with having a really clear picture or vision of where you want your life to go. You know, we all know that's important if you have a business. Any business literature will tell you that. But it's also important in your personal life. And it's amazing how so many people don't have a clear picture of where they want to be, and therefore they end up living somebody else's picture of where they want to be. Their parents, their partners, their peer group, or whatever. And living their life around someone else's expectations of what's best for you. So having a clear vision and then being fully committed to it, achieving it. And having a clear vision doesn't mean you don't change it. Of course, you change it all the time. You evolve, right? But it removes uncertainty and frustration, and I think can lead to really deep exhilaration and joy. So excellence starts, ironically, with the end in mind. It's kind of like excellence is living the future now, if you will. I think the second thing about excellence, it sort of suggests a comfort with who you are as a person. You know your strengths and weaknesses, your passions and your skills, your gifts and idiosyncrasies. And this is not easy because, frankly, it requires honesty in reflection and non-defensiveness in analysis. And, I think excellence does demand an honest assessment of who you are and a commitment to absolutely continue to grow and to change. And it calls for, being honest in the sense of measuring yourself against the best standards there are out there in whatever it is you're doing. I guess another way of saying it, it's a commitment to the journey of life of long discovery and constant renewal. I think a third element of excellence that I learned out of watching our people and what made us successful was that it's found in doing the little things to perfection. You may think the big thoughts, but it's the commitment to action and doing the little things with discipline that makes the difference. We had a colleague, have a colleague still, very senior colleague, who whenever he goes into the room to start a meeting, make sure all the chairs are straight, the table is clean, the whiteboard is clear, there's the right number of chairs at the table for the right number of people, so that when people come into that room, they have no idea who did this, but it sure says something really important is about to happen here. And excellence, it is all about, I guess, hard work. And lastly, excellence is living with unbounded passion. I discovered that your own personal enthusiasm can be a really helpful benchmark for deciding what's worth doing or not doing. Asking the question, does doing this have meaning for me? That's why I asked you in the beginning why you chose this class. If you're not having fun in what you're doing, don't do it. Life's too short. And having fun doesn't mean there are not times when you get stressed out, or there are not times when you don't want to give up, or it all seems too hard. It doesn't mean there are not times when you need to take a break. But at the end of the day, if you're not driven to get up by some almost unconscious force, if you're not excited by what you're doing, go get another vision and do something else. That's what I learned. So, you know, I guess what I learned over the last 20 years or so of my life is that to continually challenge myself, and I would suggest you consider challenging yourself, to manifest excellence in everything you do. Because it's so easy to get away with mediocrity. But guess what? Your professors may not know it. Your parents may not know it. Your girlfriend or boyfriend may not know it, but you know it. And it eats away at you. So I guess the one thing I've learned from all of this is that, you know, my 45 years and the confrontations with India and living in villages and building a business and so on, is that our life's journey can be left to chance. And who knows? You may get lucky and thrive. Or maybe you won't. Alternatively, you can make a choice. You can decide to seize this sort of very unique and enviable moment that you have before you by working to make your life a magnet for personal and professional success. And I think therein lies the opportunities for everybody's life, is seizing the moment that they live in. You know, that's the carpe diem point, right? Or back to our India theme, Mahatma Gandhi had a great saying: the future depends on what you do now. Well, today is what he really said, today. Live as if you were to die tomorrow. Learn as if you were to live forever. Now, perhaps we'd paraphrase that a bit today. You know, live as if you were to die tomorrow. I don't know how to say that more explicitly. But, you know, work together, learn, innovate, explore with a passion and with excellence, as if you were going to live forever. I think that's sort of my story and the journey I've been on.